The moment I stepped into that hotel lobby, I heard the comment that stopped me in my tracks. "Well, look who finally made it. The handyman." She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking about me. Her voice carried just enough for me to hear every word, while still giving her the freedom to pretend it wasn't meant for my ears. The people gathered around her chuckled immediately. A few smiled. Others looked away, pretending they hadn't heard it. For a second, I just stood there. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready that morning. My shirt was freshly pressed. My shoes were polished so carefully they practically reflected the lobby lights. I wanted to look respectable for my son's wedding day. Yet in a single sentence, I suddenly felt out of place. At 64 years old, I felt like a man who had wandered into a gathering where everyone had already decided he didn't belong. What made it worse was who said it. The woman laughing at my expense was about to become family. She was my son's future mother-in-law. And judging by the reactions around her, she wasn't alone in her opinion. For a brief moment, I seriously considered leaving. I wish I could say otherwise, but it's the truth. My body had already begun turning toward the entrance. One more step and I might have walked right back out into the parking lot. Then Darius appeared. He moved through the crowd quickly, as if he'd been searching for me. When he reached me, he placed a hand on my shoulder and leaned close. "Dad," he whispered quietly, "just trust me. Tonight." That was all. No explanation. No details. Just those 3 words and a look in his eyes that told me something was happening beneath the surface. I didn't understand what he meant. Not even a little. But I trusted my son. What I didn't know then was that before the evening ended, everyone in that room would see things very differently. My name is Raymond Cobb, though most people simply call me Ray. I've spent my entire life in Montgomery County, Texas, where the highways gradually disappear into pine forests and neighbors are measured in acres instead of feet. My property sits about 40 miles north of Houston. 32 acres of dirt, trees, livestock, and memories. My father worked that land before me. He earned his living on oil rigs, handling pipe systems during the week and tending cattle whenever he could find spare hours. Like a lot of men from his generation, he believed work wasn't something you talked about. It was simply something you did. I inherited that lesson early. By 18, I was working full-time around drilling equipment. For more than 2 decades, I maintained machinery, repaired systems, and spent long days in places where the heat felt like it could melt the soles off your boots. When I retired at 55, I came back home. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. I planted vegetables. Expanded the cattle operation. Managed a small pecan grove that still manages to test my patience every harvest season. It's not the kind of life that impresses wealthy strangers. Nobody's eyes widen when you tell them you grow feed corn or repair irrigation lines. But everything I own was earned honestly. Every fence post. Every acre. Every building. The proof still sits in my hands. The calluses never left. My wife Lorraine used to joke that I could sand lumber with my palms. She was remarkable. Not loud. Not flashy. Just incredibly wise. She understood people better than anyone I've ever met. Give her 5 minutes with someone, and she'd tell you exactly who they were. More often than not, 20 years later she'd still be right. Together we raised 2 children. Our daughter Simone is 31 now. She married a history teacher named Gerald, and they live in Houston with their son, Theo. That boy has enough personality for 3 children. Every time he visits the farm, I laugh more in a weekend than I do the entire rest of the month. Then there's Darius. My son. 33 years old. Engineer. Scholarship graduate. The kind of man every father hopes his child becomes. Watching him walk across that graduation stage remains one of the proudest moments of my life. Only one memory surpasses it. The day he was born. And right behind both of those moments is another memory that still lives with me. Lorraine lying in a hospital bed, holding my hand. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were calm. "The kids are good, Ray," she told me. "They're going to be okay." 2 days later, she was gone. Heart failure. Quick. Cruel. Unfair. 5 years have passed, and some mornings it still feels impossible to believe. After losing her, Darius and I became even closer. Every weekend he drove out to the farm. We worked side by side repairing equipment, clearing brush, fixing fences, or simply sitting on the porch after lunch talking about life. No matter how busy he became, he made time. That meant more to me than he'll ever know. Around 20 months before the wedding, he introduced me to Vanessa Hartwell. She came from Scottsdale, Arizona. And not just Scottsdale. The kind of Scottsdale where wealth becomes part of a person's identity. The kind of money that doesn't need to brag because everyone already knows it's there. Her father, Preston Hartwell, owned investment companies tied to commercial developments. Her mother, Claire, spent her time serving on charity boards and attending events where appearances mattered more than conversations. The first time Vanessa came to the farm, she was perfectly polite. She smiled. Asked questions. Complimented dinner. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But Lorraine had taught me something years ago. "Never trust the smile first," she'd say. "Watch the eyes." And Vanessa's eyes told a different story. Whenever she looked around my home, there was evaluation behind her gaze. She noticed the workshop. The tools. My rough hands. The aging farmhouse. Nothing she said was openly disrespectful. Yet I constantly felt like I was being measured against a standard I couldn't see. And somehow, I already knew I wasn't passing. I convinced myself I was imagining it. For 18 months, that's exactly what I did. Then I met her parents. And suddenly everything made much more sense. Preston and Claire Hartwell had a way of making ordinary people feel invisible. I visited their Arizona property once and felt like I'd accidentally walked into a luxury resort. The place had guest houses, fountains, imported stonework, and enough garage space to hold vehicles worth more than my entire farm equipment collection. Preston shook my hand with the enthusiasm of a man signing paperwork. Claire asked questions about farming the way people discuss antique hobbies they've outgrown. At one point she described my livelihood as charmingly pastoral. I remember having to look up later whether I'd been insulted. Turns out I had. But Darius loved Vanessa. And that mattered more than my pride. So I smiled, stayed quiet, and kept moving forward. What I didn't realize was that the Hartwells had already made up their minds about who I was. The only thing they got wrong was everything. What I didn't realize was that the Hartwells had already made up their minds about who I was. The only thing they got wrong was everything. That truth began revealing itself a few months later during the engagement dinner. The event was held at the Four Seasons in Houston, the kind of place where every surface shines and every detail seems carefully arranged to remind guests how much money is being spent. More than 50 people attended. Business associates, family friends, distant relatives, and people whose names I never quite caught. I arrived later than intended. A broken water line on the property had demanded attention that morning, and by the time I finished repairs and started the drive into Houston, I was running behind schedule. Still, I made the effort. Freshly pressed shirt. Clean jacket. Boots polished until they reflected the overhead lights. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I simply wanted to show respect for my son's special evening. The moment I stepped inside, however, I was reminded exactly how certain people viewed me. I heard Vanessa speaking to her mother near the entrance. Her voice wasn't raised. In fact, it was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who assumes there will be no consequences. "Oh good," she said. "The handyman finally showed up." A few people laughed. Others immediately became interested in their drinks. One woman turned away so quickly she nearly spilled her champagne. The entire room seemed to contract for a second. Not silent. Just uncomfortable. The way people become when they know something wrong has happened but don't want to acknowledge it. I wish I could tell you that I ignored it. I didn't. The words landed exactly where she intended them to. For a brief moment, every insecurity I'd ever had came rushing back. Suddenly I wasn't a man who had spent decades building a life. I wasn't a father. I wasn't a landowner. I wasn't a husband who had stood beside the same woman through good years and bad. I felt like a nervous kid standing in the wrong room, hoping nobody noticed he didn't belong. Humiliation has a strange way of doing that. It doesn't matter how old you are or how much you've accomplished. For a few seconds, it can shrink your entire world. And honestly, I nearly left. One more step and I would have walked right back through those doors. Then Darius appeared. Almost as if he had sensed exactly what was happening. He moved toward me quickly and placed a hand on my shoulder. His voice was low. "Dad, trust me. Just tonight." That was it. No explanation. No reassurance. Just a request. And because it came from him, I listened. The evening continued. I found myself seated beside several engineers who worked with Darius on various agricultural and infrastructure projects. They were thoughtful men. They asked about irrigation systems, livestock management, and land conservation. For the first time that night, I felt seen. Not judged. Not measured. Simply respected. Yet every so often my eyes drifted toward the head table. Vanessa sat between her parents, smiling effortlessly. Preston occasionally looked across the room toward me. Whenever our eyes met, he held the gaze a little too long. There was something in that expression. The confidence of a man who believes he already knows your value. A man convinced he has you figured out. By the end of the night, most guests had gone home. The ballroom was nearly empty. As I prepared to leave, Darius approached and asked if I had a few minutes. We walked together to the parking structure and climbed into his truck. The engine remained off. The cab was quiet. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at his phone. "Dad," he said carefully, "I need you to hear something. But promise me you'll listen to all of it before saying anything." A knot formed in my stomach immediately. He opened a folder. Dozens of audio files appeared on the screen. Each labeled with dates. Each organized meticulously. Before I could ask what any of it meant, he pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled the truck. It was unmistakably hers. But it wasn't the version of Vanessa I had seen at family dinners or holiday gatherings. There was no warmth. No charm. No carefully practiced politeness. This voice was relaxed. Confident. And completely unguarded. 6 weeks, Mom, she said. Then everything falls into place. A second voice followed. Claire. Calm as ever. And the property? Vanessa laughed softly. Dad already has investors interested. Once we're married, it'll be easy. The next words hit harder than anything that came before. His father trusts him completely. If Darius asks him to sign paperwork, he'll sign it. I felt cold. Truly cold. As if all the air had vanished from the truck. The property they were discussing wasn't just land. It was my home. My family's history. My father's legacy. The place where Lorraine and I built our lives. The acreage happened to sit near a planned highway expansion corridor that county officials had quietly approved over a year earlier. Most residents had no idea. But people with powerful real estate connections certainly did. And Preston Hartwell was one of those people. The more recordings Darius played, the worse it became. There wasn't a misunderstanding. There wasn't a mistake. There wasn't any room for interpretation. It was a plan. A carefully designed operation. Preston had identified the future value of my property long before anyone else. He had calculated potential profits. Mapped timelines. Contacted developers. And somewhere along the way, my son had become the key piece on the board. There were videos. Documents. Photographs. Evidence collected over weeks. Darius had quietly investigated after noticing inconsistencies in conversations. What he discovered was staggering. Among the files were draft agreements bearing my name. Signatures that looked authentic at first glance. Notary certifications. Official-looking paperwork. All of it fake. Every bit of it. Experts would later confirm that the documents had been fabricated. The signatures forged. The notary seals fraudulent. But sitting there in that truck, I didn't need experts. I could see exactly what they had intended. The entire scheme had already been prepared. All they needed was access. And they believed marriage would provide it. I stared at the phone in my hands. The recordings continued playing. Yet my mind struggled to process what I was hearing. Eventually I looked at my son. "What are you going to do?" The answer came immediately. He had already decided. And to be honest, part of me wasn't comfortable with it. I was raised differently. My father believed conflicts should be handled privately. Quietly. Without audiences. Without spectacle. For a moment, I considered urging caution. Cancel the wedding. Protect the family. Walk away. No public confrontation. No humiliation. Then I remembered Vanessa's voice. The casual way she discussed my life's work as if it were an asset waiting to be harvested. I remembered Preston's smug confidence. I remembered every dismissive smile. Every insult disguised as sophistication. And most of all, I remembered Lorraine. I could practically hear her voice. The same words she'd spoken countless times whenever I was tempted to ignore wrongdoing. "Let the truth breathe, Ray." I looked at my son. Took a deep breath. And nodded. "I'm with you." The following morning, Darius introduced me to a close friend named Devon. An audiovisual specialist. And that was when I discovered just how much preparation had already taken place. Because what would happen on the wedding day wasn't spontaneous. It was precise. Carefully planned. And before the Hartwells realized what was happening, every secret they had worked so hard to hide was about to become impossible to deny. The following morning, Darius introduced me to a close friend named Devon. An audiovisual specialist. And that was when I discovered just how much preparation had already taken place. Because what would happen on the wedding day wasn't spontaneous. It was precise. Carefully planned. And before the Hartwells realized what was happening, every secret they had worked so hard to hide was about to become impossible to deny. That night, after leaving Darius and Devon, I returned alone to my hotel room. I hung my suit jacket carefully by the window and sat for a long time without turning on the television. The city lights stretched across Houston outside the glass, but my attention wasn't on them. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror. Not studying the suit. Not worrying about the wedding. Just looking at the face of a man who had spent more than 6 decades trying to do right by the people he loved. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about the countless mornings we had spent together on that property before sunrise. Coffee in hand. Boots by the door. Planning another day. Then my mind drifted further back. To my father. And to his father before him. Men who worked through droughts, broken machinery, market crashes, and every hardship that rural life could throw at them. Every fence post on that land carried a story. Every acre had been paid for with sacrifice. And somewhere during those quiet moments, something inside me settled. Not anger. Not excitement. Something simpler. Certainty. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock the following afternoon. I arrived well before most guests. The ballroom looked beautiful. White flowers lined the aisle. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished floors. Everything appeared perfect. At least on the surface. The Hartwells arrived not long afterward. They entered exactly as I expected. Confident. Relaxed. Certain of themselves. Preston moved through the room like a man attending the successful conclusion of a business deal. Claire floated beside him, elegant and composed, greeting guests with practiced smiles. Behind them came friends, associates, and family members. The entire performance of prestige followed closely behind. Then my eyes found Darius. Standing at the front of the room. Waiting. To everyone else, he probably looked like any groom moments before his wedding. Maybe a little nervous. Maybe emotional. But I knew my son too well. There was no uncertainty in him. His shoulders were steady. His expression controlled. His focus absolute. He wasn't waiting. He was prepared. A few minutes later, the music began. The room rose to its feet. All heads turned toward the entrance. Vanessa appeared at the far end of the aisle. Her gown was breathtaking. The kind of dress that probably required an entire team of people to transport and maintain. She moved gracefully beside her father, smiling at guests as cameras flashed around her. If someone had walked into the ballroom at that moment with no knowledge of what was coming, they would have seen a picture-perfect wedding. A successful family. A beautiful bride. A promising future. Nothing more. Preston escorted her forward with unmistakable pride. When he finally placed her hand into Darius's, he wore the expression of a man who believed victory was already secured. Then he returned to his seat beside Claire. For a brief moment, Claire looked directly at me. This time, I didn't lower my eyes. I held her gaze calmly. Neither of us looked away. The officiant began speaking. Guests smiled. A few relatives dabbed tears from their eyes. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. Until it didn't. Eventually the officiant turned toward Darius. Darius Cobb, do you take Vanessa Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife? The room grew still. Darius nodded slightly. Then he raised one hand. Before I answer, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom, there is something everyone here deserves to see. Confusion spread immediately. The officiant blinked. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Not gradually. Instantly. And then, at the rear of the room, the large projection screen illuminated. What happened next unfolded in stages. At first people simply looked confused. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Guests searched for explanations. Then footage appeared. Faces became recognizable. Voices echoed through the speakers. And slowly, understanding began moving across the room. Not all at once. Like a wave. Vanessa's voice filled the ballroom. Clear. Undeniable. Relaxed enough to reveal what she truly thought. She spoke about the property. Spoke about future buyers. Spoke about plans that depended upon gaining access to my land through marriage. Then came Claire's voice asking questions. Then Vanessa answering them. Calmly. Confidently. As though discussing routine business. I wasn't watching the screen. I was watching the people. The reactions fascinated me. A woman near the center aisle covered her mouth. One elderly guest sank slowly into his chair. Several people stared in disbelief. Others looked toward the Hartwells. Then Preston exploded to his feet. "Turn it off," he shouted. "This is manipulated. It's fake." But the presentation continued. The next recording appeared. This time it wasn't Vanessa. It was Preston himself. Discussing projected land values. Talking about highway development. Referring to acquisition strategies. Speaking in the detached language of profit calculations. The ballroom seemed to lose oxygen. You could feel the atmosphere changing. Several guests stood up. A few headed toward the exits. Others remained frozen. Then another recording played. This one from the night of the engagement dinner. A private conversation. Vanessa and Claire speaking candidly. Mocking me. Laughing about pretending to tolerate my presence. Discussing how little longer they would need to maintain appearances. Those words hit harder than any insult I'd ever heard directly. Because they revealed exactly who they were when they thought nobody was listening. Still, I remained seated. I had promised Darius I would stay calm. And I intended to honor that promise. At the altar, Vanessa was crying now. Not elegant tears. Not controlled emotion. Panic. Raw panic. She kept insisting everything had been misunderstood. Claiming the recordings lacked context. Begging Darius to explain. But Darius never looked at her. Instead, he faced the guests. His voice remained steady. Every word deliberate. He explained the forensic analysis. The authentication process. The forged paperwork. The fabricated signatures. The timeline. The evidence. All of it verified. All of it documented. All of it real. Meanwhile Preston stormed toward the audiovisual booth. Only to discover that Devon had anticipated exactly that reaction. The presentation continued uninterrupted. Documents appeared. Emails. Contracts. Financial projections. Development correspondence. Evidence stretching back months before the engagement itself. Every new image made the situation clearer. This wasn't opportunism. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was planning. Then something happened that nobody expected. A man stood from the third row. Well-dressed. Professional. Calm. He introduced himself without raising his voice. He explained that he served as an assistant district attorney and had attended as a personal acquaintance of the Hartwell family. Then he looked directly at Preston. The silence that followed felt enormous. When he spoke again, every person listened. He stated plainly that what had been presented appeared to constitute evidence of multiple serious criminal offenses. And he advised Preston not to leave the premises. For the first time all afternoon, Preston had no response. I remember thinking how much Lorraine would have enjoyed seeing that moment. Not because she was vindictive. Because she valued truth. And the truth was finally standing in full daylight. Claire sat weeping. Vanessa attempted to leave but found herself unable to push through the crowd gathering near the exits. Eventually she collapsed onto the ballroom floor. The expensive gown spread around her like spilled silk. The image would have seemed tragic under different circumstances. But all I felt was relief. Years of burden seemed to lift from my shoulders. The anxiety. The suspicion. The constant feeling that something wasn't right. All of it finally released. And if you've ever spent months doubting your instincts while everyone else told you everything was fine, then you understand exactly how powerful that feeling can be. It's the moment when reality finally catches up to what your heart already knew. It's the moment when people stop overlooking you and finally see the truth standing right in front of them. Within 20 minutes, law enforcement arrived. The Hartwells were escorted from the building. Preston continued arguing. Claire hid behind dark sunglasses despite being indoors. Vanessa walked with her veil twisted and disheveled. Around them, guests stood in stunned silence. Some recorded videos. Others simply watched. One of Vanessa's relatives approached Darius in tears, apologizing repeatedly and insisting she had known nothing about any of it. And standing there in the middle of that ballroom, I realized something important. The wedding was over. But the story was only beginning. One of Vanessa's relatives approached Darius in tears, apologizing repeatedly and insisting she had known nothing about any of it. And standing there in the middle of that ballroom, I realized something important. The wedding was over. But the story was only beginning. For several minutes after the Hartwells were escorted out, nobody seemed quite sure what to do next. The decorations remained exactly where they had been placed. The floral arrangements still lined the aisle. The photographers stood awkwardly near the walls. The musicians waited for instructions that never came. And somewhere behind the ballroom doors, an entire wedding reception sat prepared for a celebration that no longer existed. Or so it seemed. Darius eventually found me standing near one of the windows overlooking the hotel gardens. Neither of us spoke right away. We simply stood there, absorbing everything that had happened. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that follows a storm. The kind where you're still listening for thunder even though the sky has already cleared. Finally, Darius looked around the room and smiled for the first time all day. "The food's already paid for, Dad." I laughed. Not because it was particularly funny. Because it was exactly the kind of thing Lorraine would have said. Practical. Simple. Grounded. A reminder that life keeps moving. I followed his gaze around the ballroom. Many guests had already gone home. Others remained. The interesting part was who stayed. Darius's closest friends were still there. Simone had arrived at my side almost immediately after everything unfolded, with Gerald right beside her. Several people from Vanessa's extended family had quietly separated themselves from the chaos and remained behind. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked relieved. But they stayed. That mattered. Then Darius said something I'll never forget. "I'd rather celebrate the truth than mourn a lie." And that was exactly what we did. The music finally played. The catering staff opened the reception. People gathered around tables. Conversations slowly returned. Not about scandal. Not about gossip. About family. About honesty. About survival. At one point Simone pulled me onto the dance floor. I protested, naturally. A man my age always pretends he doesn't want to dance. It's part of the job description. But she wouldn't accept no for an answer. As we moved across the floor, she reached up and placed both hands against my face. Then she smiled. "Mama would be proud of both of you." Those words hit harder than anything that had happened that day. Harder than Vanessa's insults. Harder than the recordings. Harder than the confrontation itself. Because deep down, every decision I'd made since Lorraine died had been measured against one question. Would she approve? And for the first time in a long while, I knew the answer. Without hesitation. Yes. Looking back now, I don't know if I would have handled the situation the same way when I was younger. At 44, I might have exploded. At 34, I might have thrown a punch. At 24, I probably would have done both. But Darius possessed a kind of discipline that impressed me more than any public victory ever could. Think about what he endured. For months he uncovered evidence that the woman he intended to marry wasn't who she claimed to be. He listened to recordings that would break most people's hearts. He discovered a conspiracy aimed directly at his family. And through all of it, he never lost control. He didn't scream. He didn't seek revenge for the sake of revenge. He simply allowed facts to speak for themselves. That kind of restraint is rare. And it taught me something. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is the ability to stay steady when every emotion is demanding movement. The legal process began almost immediately afterward. Alton Burke proved to be exactly the kind of man you hope appears when the truth matters. Methodical. Patient. Relentless. Every recording was analyzed. Every document examined. Every timeline verified. As investigators dug deeper, an even larger picture emerged. The Hartwells weren't merely greedy. They were drowning. The image they presented to the world had been carefully constructed over many years. The estate in Scottsdale. The social connections. The charitable organizations. The business empire. All of it looked impressive from a distance. Up close, it was collapsing. Debt had spread through nearly every corner of their finances. Loans had piled up. Assets were leveraged. Obligations exceeded resources. The entire structure depended on maintaining appearances long enough to secure the next opportunity. And unfortunately, we had become that opportunity. Learning that created mixed emotions. I didn't feel sorry for them. Not exactly. But I began to understand something important. People rarely wake up one morning and decide to become dishonest. More often, they compromise a little. Then a little more. Then they build entire identities around avoiding consequences. Eventually they become trapped inside their own deception. That didn't excuse what they did. But it explained it. 3 weeks after the wedding, a woman named Patricia Vance contacted our attorney. She had seen news coverage related to the investigation. Her story sounded disturbingly familiar. Several years earlier she had been involved with a business associate connected to the Hartwells. At first everything appeared normal. Then came questions about property ownership. Then requests involving financial access. Then pressure. When she refused, the relationship deteriorated rapidly. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Soon another individual came forward. Then another. Patterns began emerging. What happened to our family wasn't an isolated event. We were simply the first people who managed to stop it before the plan succeeded. A settlement offer arrived before trial. $300,000. Along with a carefully written public apology. In exchange, criminal proceedings would end. I'll be honest. That kind of money gets your attention. Especially when you spend your life counting expenses carefully. I sat at my kitchen table looking at the proposal. Darius sat across from me. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then I folded the papers and pushed them aside. No. That was all. One word. Not because I didn't need the money. I did. Not because I wanted revenge. I didn't. I said no because some things can't be measured in dollars. Patricia deserved her day in court. The people who came after her deserved justice too. And whoever might become the next target deserved protection. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The defense attempted every strategy available. They portrayed Darius as a bitter former fiancé seeking retaliation. They suggested manipulation. Misinterpretation. Personal vendettas. The problem was evidence. Evidence doesn't care about narratives. Certified recordings are difficult to explain away. Forged signatures don't magically become legitimate. Patterns don't disappear when multiple witnesses describe the same behavior across different years and different cities. One by one, every argument collapsed. The verdicts came quickly. Guilty on all counts. Preston received 11 years. Claire received 7. Vanessa received 9. I still remember the judge's final remarks. In fact, I wrote them down afterward and placed them beside the kitchen window overlooking the property. She said that their greatest mistake was believing dignity had a price. Believing integrity could be manipulated. Believing a person's worth could be calculated based on status rather than character. Those words stayed with me. Because they captured the entire story better than I ever could. After everything ended, Darius made a decision that surprised many people. He moved back to the farm. Not because he failed. Not because he needed refuge. Because he chose it. He told me something one evening while we repaired an irrigation line together. The city always felt like an audition. I knew exactly what he meant. Too many people spend their lives performing for audiences that never intended to applaud. He consults remotely now. Helps manage agricultural projects. Oversees improvements on the property. And he's happier than I've ever seen him. 2 years later, he married Tanya. A soil scientist from Huntsville. The first time I met her, she arrived wearing work boots and immediately started asking intelligent questions about drainage systems. I liked her within 10 minutes. Not because she agreed with me. Because she was genuine. She never treated people differently based on their bank accounts. She never looked down on honest work. And perhaps most importantly, she never made anyone feel invisible. Their wedding took place beneath the pecan trees on our property. 40 people attended. Not hundreds. Just people who genuinely cared. Friends. Family. Neighbors. People who knew our names before the invitations arrived. It was the happiest day I'd experienced since losing Lorraine. And through everything that happened, I learned a lesson I had to earn the hard way. The people most determined to diminish you are often threatened by what you represent. Vanessa didn't call me a handyman because she truly believed that's all I was. She said it because reducing me made her actions easier to justify. If she could convince herself I was insignificant, then exploiting my family became easier to rationalize. That's what many people do. They shrink others in their minds so they don't have to confront their own choices. The mistake is believing them. The mistake is accepting their judgment as truth. There was never anything wrong with me. There was never anything wrong with my land. There was never anything wrong with the life Lorraine and I built. The problem belonged to them. Not us. And what Darius understood long before anyone else in that ballroom was that truth doesn't need permission. It doesn't require approval. It doesn't wait for convenience. It only needs someone brave enough to stand still and let it be seen. So I'll leave you with the same question I've asked myself more than once. Is there a place in your life where you've been shrinking yourself to make someone else comfortable? And if there is, how much longer are you willing to do it? Because I'm 64 years old now. I still wake before sunrise. I still have calluses on my hands. The pecan trees are still standing. My son still drives out for dinner. And every night I go to sleep knowing exactly who I am. In the end, that's the only inheritance I ever hope to leave behind.